Hello and welcome to a live stream video on a Wednesday night. I have information here about scriptures fulfilled about the crucifixion. And so I've got two different groups going on at the same time. I'm not going to be able to answer any questions during this, I don't think, because I'm not sure how to see them. But scriptures about the crucifixion, one of the first things I would ask is, where in the world do you start? I'm going to start right in the middle, Isaiah chapter 53, starting at verse 3. And then we're going to flow from where Jesus is being generally despised, then specifically betrayed, cruelly beaten, and then pierced. So here it goes. This can be, if you're wondering how long it will be, probably already know, but close to an hour, at least 40 minutes. So here it is. And the first prophecy we're going to look at is Isaiah 53. So I have all mine written out. I'm not going to be flipping pages, I hope. So if you want to follow along, just take notes and then listen. Chapter 53, verse 3 of Isaiah says, "He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with our suffering, like one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not." I think we can see this from all of Jesus' life, really. In John chapter 1, verse 10 and 11, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. In John chapter 11, we find that Caiaphas plotted for his death, chapter 11, starting with verse 47 through 55. He was despised and rejected. Well, I think he was despised by men mocking him. Matthew chapter 27, verse 9. Men dressed him up in a robe. They put a crown on his head, and they mocked him. Jesus said, "You have rejected the capstone. The capstone has been made into the cornerstone." He said this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Peter uses it in the book of Acts. Paul uses it in the book of Ephesians, chapter 2, verse 20. Peter also uses it in his first book of 1 Peter, chapter 2, verse 7. And this is a quote from Psalm 118. This is a great psalm. I would suggest you read it this week. It gives some great indication as to who Jesus is in light of his death, burial, and resurrection. Chapter 22 does as well, but Psalm 118 is a great reference point. Just reading through that, I think you'll garner a lot of information about who Jesus is, and recognize maybe some songs that we sing. But Jesus was rejected as the capstone and made the cornerstone. And that he used in his own teaching in a parable in Matthew chapter 21, Mark 12, and Luke 20. But that is the idea of Jesus being rejected. And even the apostles, I think, added to this so much by abandoning Jesus the night he's betrayed. Jesus is out with his men praying. Judas comes along and kisses him, betrays him with a kiss. And in Mark chapter 14, verse 50, he says that they all abandoned him. Everyone fled. And I think Peter was an icing on the cake, because after they fled, Peter kind of tagged along. But then even as he tagged along, he followed and then denied Jesus 3 times, just as Jesus told him he would. And in Luke 22, verse 61 and 62, you see and find Peter in the courtyard talking to some people and looking at at them and denying that he even knew Jesus, that he was a part of his group. And while Peter's in the courtyard warming his hands in the fire, he looks up, and Jesus' eyes and Peter's eyes meet. And I can just, oh, Peter, his heart broke, I am sure, because then he realized, oh no, I just denied the Lord, my friend, my Savior. And he ran out and wept bitterly. Man, can you imagine having done that? Being in that moment with Peter. That all, I think, illustrates what this Isaiah passage in chapter 53, verse 3 says, that Jesus was despised and rejected. He's a man of sorrows. Peter broke his heart. I think we have all broken his heart by sin. But that's why Jesus died, that our heart would be mended and that we could have peace with God. That's just the first prophecy. The second one comes from Psalm 41, verse 9. He says, even my close friend whom I trusted, he who shared my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. I bet you can figure out who this is. And Mark chapter 14 is a fulfillment of this Psalm 41, verse 9. In Mark 14, verse 10, it says, Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. And in John 13, when Jesus is having a meal, the last meal with his 12 beloved friends, Judas took the bread. Satan entered into his heart and he left. It says in chapter 13, verse 27 through 30, it talks about Judas leaving. This was the fulfillment of the prophecy from Psalm 41, verse 9. A close friend lifted his heel against me. The third prophecy for tonight, Zechariah chapter 11, verses 12 and 13. Say, I told them, if you think it best, give me my pay, and if not, keep it. So they paid me 30 pieces of silver. This is along with Judas's working that night. He was paid 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. And we find this in Matthew chapter 26, verses 14 through 16. And in chapter 27, verses 3 through 10 of Matthew, we find this fulfillment where Peter takes the coins and then in Matthew 27, he throws it back at them. Judas said, I have sinned. And the cold response of the leadership of that time, what is that to us? Who cares if you sin? That's your problem. And a lot of people feel that way about sin. But Jesus took it upon his shoulders. And these prophecies, I think, help illustrate his love for us, his love for Judas. I think Jesus would have accepted Judas if Judas would have said, forgive me, I love you. But Judas didn't do that. He let the guilt get the best of him, ran, killed himself. He hung himself. But we see this prophecy from Zechariah chapter 11, verses 12 and 13. The fulfillment in Matthew 26, verses 14, and Matthew 27, verses 3 through 10. which leads to another part where in chapter 27, he the Sanhedrin, Jewish leaders at the time, bought a potter's field. And this is a challenging prophecy fulfillment because the prophecy isn't terribly clear, but Matthew says it's a fulfillment of the prophecy that to go buy a potter's field. So we use that. It's a fulfillment of Jeremiah chapter 19 and chapter 32, verses 6 through 9. It's a challenging one, but they did buy a potter's field. And we find in Acts chapter 1 that they called it a field of blood because there's where um, Judas Iscariot hung himself, and it says in Acts, his bowels spilled out. That sounds kind of gross, but that's not the grossest thing that happened in prophecy. Isaiah 53 is the fifth one. This is number 5. Isaiah 53, verse 7. Jesus was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is silent. He did not open his mouth. Mark 15:5 says, Jesus made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. I think it'd be amazing to all of us that no one would reply. Jesus didn't stand up and say, "Hey, I don't deserve this punishment. Hey, I'm good." He's one guy that could say I'm good, right? Jesus did not yell and say that he didn't deserve this. He didn't defend himself because he knew there was a greater purpose in mind for this crucifixion, this cruel treatment of his body and of his perfect life was for your sin and for my sin, for payment, atonement. That is Bible prophecy from chapter 53 of Isaiah, verse 7. Mark 15:5 is the fulfillment. The sixth one is from Isaiah 52. We're going to back up a few verses now in Isaiah chapter 52, verse 14, just the last couple verses of the chapter. This one is in verse 14. He said he was disfigured, just as there were many who were appalled at him. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any man, and his form marred beyond human likeness. Ugh. They did some cruel things to Jesus, and I'm going to point these out. John 18, verse 22, they spit upon him. That doesn't do much for being disfigured. People spit upon don't look too good. Probably appalled at him for that. But the worst ones are found in the other Gospels, Matthew chapter 26. Verse 67 and 68 is a long chapter. In verse 67, it says, they struck him with their hands and they said, prophesy to us, Christ, who hit you? So they're just taking their fists and hitting Jesus across the face. And in Mark 14, verse 65, they said they blindfolded him and struck him with their fists. Guards took him and beat him. They struck him with a staff in chapter 15, verse 19 of Mark. And in Matthew, this is where it really gets cruel. In Matthew chapter 27, verse 31, they didn't just spit on him. They struck him with a staff over and over and over again. And guess where they struck him? In the head, in the face. I don't think they broke his nose. I don't think they broke his skull. But they hammered on him. Oh, they were cruel. And they were harsh. They treated him harshly. And this prophecy from Isaiah 52, verse 14, came to fruition that night when after Jesus had been betrayed. And in Matthew 27, verse 31, they struck him with a staff over and over. Not just with the fists, that's bad enough, but like getting a small, thin bat and hitting a guy on the head. And in Luke 22, verse 63, they said, men who were guarding Jesus began mocking him and beating him, blindfolded him, and saying the same thing this other had. And even in John chapter 19, Pilate had Jesus flogged. Do you think Jesus was not disfigured? I would think his eyes would be so swollen, his mouth and lips so swollen he could hardly talk, and it would be like having cotton balls in his mouth that he could hardly even say anything, and blood coming out of his mouth when he does talk. He doesn't say much that night, but when he does, he's in agony, and when he does, I'm sure he's challenged because they beat him to a pulp and didn't care. Jesus was in total agony. They crucified him, which leads us to the next prophecy in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5. A very common one I think we're familiar with, and we have heard in several different ways. We sing about it on a hill called Calvary. Jesus was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him. By his wounds, we are healed. Jesus was pierced, was crushed, was beaten, pummeled, mocked, spit upon. Oh, man. Pilate handed him over to be crucified. In each of these accounts, from Matthew chapter 27, verse 31, Mark 15, verse 20, Luke 23, verse 33, and in John 19, 16. Each of these scriptures point out how Jesus was crucified. And then following in those verses, it talks about the whole events. And these events are a little bit different. They're described differently, like different eyewitnesses would describe a different account of the same event. And through it, we find Jesus, while on the cross, he said 7 different things. And I'm not going to go over those. But Jesus, when he was on the cross, he did, and I'm going to look for those real quick because I do want to highlight them, and maybe I don't have them right before me. But at any rate, there were 7 words. They call them 7 different words of Jesus on the cross. 3 found in the book of Luke. The first one probably being, and this is the kind of the accounting of most scholars, the first one is, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And he's talking about those who crucified him. I think he included the guards and the beaters that blindfolded him, that drove the nails in his hands, that pummeled him with the staff, that mocked him in the presence of Herod and in presence of Pilate. Father, forgive them. Wow. That's one of 3 of the phrases that Luke talks about. Matthew and Mark only have one phrase, and they both use the same one, and we'll get to in just a moment. And in the book of John, there are 3 phrases in this crucifixion event. While Jesus is being crucified, he does speak. I'm sure his voice and his words are slurry and a little bit not clear. I mean, his mouth is swollen. I think his jaw is probably out of socket. He can hardly talk, and he's in excruciating pain. And Jesus says this in Matthew and Mark: my God, why have you forsaken me? Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, or something like that. Oh, yes. And that comes to the next prophecy found in Psalm 22. I like this about Psalm 22. It introduces the chapter. Chapter 22 of the book of Psalms opens with my God, why have you forsaken me? I think Jesus knew full well why. But even Jesus, I'm sure Jesus took some personal introspection, the time of the most excruciating, difficult, um, horrific, painful time of his life. I was thinking, is this worth it? Are you worth it? Am I worth it? Most of us would say no, but God loves us so much that yes, He thinks we're worth it. And Jesus was willing to take the punishment for you so that God's wrath would be satisfied upon Him and not you. Hebrews chapter 12 reminds us in this second verse that for the joy set before Him, He endured the cross. While he might have asked this question, Eloi, Eloi, my God, why do you forsake me? I really think what Jesus was doing with this, he might have had some introspection, but I think what he was doing was saying, hey, look up that Psalm. Psalm 22, you need to go there. It wasn't divided into chapters at this time, but opening words were, my God, why have you forsaken me? Read the rest of that chapter, Psalm 22, and you'll find that it sounds like, oh no, they're crucifying a guy. They're dividing his garments, and we're going to go through these in just a minute. And you're going to see how Psalm 22 sounds like David was there writing down the history of what was going on in the context of Jesus' death on a cross. When Jesus asked this question, I think he's telling us to go back to look and look at this eighth prophecy, Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from the words of my groaning. Oh my God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer by night, and I am not silent. But it talks about the crucifixion, about the ninth hour in Matthew chapter 27, verse 46. About the ninth hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice. And when he said this in Aramaic, some people were saying, is he crying out for Elijah? What's he saying? I'm sure they couldn't understand his garbled, challenged jaws trying to speak. That's the eighth Bible prophecy. The ninth is from Psalm 22 again, verses 7 and 8. He says, all who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. Oh my. Does it not sound like the teachers of the law who are mocking him and the other man being crucified by him that's saying, hey, you saved others, save yourself? In Matthew chapter 27, verse 41 through verse 44, it says, in the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders mocked him. He saved others, they said. He can't save himself, but he can't save himself. He's the king of Israel. Let him come down from the cross and we'll believe in him then. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, I am the Son of God. In the same way, the robbers who were crucified with him also heaped insults upon him. Wow. And we got to remember that Jesus said, Father, forgive them. for they don't know what they're doing. And I think he's pointing to this psalm so that we'll read it and recognize what's going on in this chapter of the book of Psalm. Chapter 22, verse 14 says, "My bones are out of joint. I'm poured out like water. My heart has turned into wax and has melted away within me." I referred to the earlier discussion when I said they struck him with their hands. They blindfolded him, and they struck him with their fists and their staff, and they told him prophesy. You know, they were plumbing him with their hands and just pulverizing him. Oh, his bones out of joint. I can imagine that his jawbone would be. Well, Psalm 22 is a good one to look at, and in that chapter, verse 15, he says, "My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death." Remember when Jesus cried out, "I am thirsty," in the book of John? In Matthew, it says, chapter 27, verse 48. It's in the book of John, chapter 19, where he says, "I thirst." Immediately, one of them ran out and got a sponge, and they filled it with wine vinegar and put it on a stick and offered it to Jesus to drink. Matthew 27, verse 48. And in John chapter 19, verse 28 is where he said, "I thirst." I think this is a fulfillment of Psalm chapter 22, verse 15. And the last one is, "I count all my bones," from Psalm chapter 22, verse 17 through 18. "I count all my bones. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing." And in John 19, verse 23, it says, "When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarments remaining. His garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom." Wow. I don't think he could be any more clear about a prophecy in the Old Testament. It sounds like David wrote this as he was watching these events, dividing his garments, casting lots for his clothing. He's thirsty. His jaw's out of joint. My God, why do you forsake me?" All of these come from John 22. In John 22, I don't know if it's really a prophecy or not, but it ends with this remarkable statement that they proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, for he has done it. I think this is forecasting what Jesus said on the cross in chapter 19 of John, verse 30. When on the cross, Jesus said, "It is finished." And it seems appropriate to end here. The key prophetic passages that we went over are from Isaiah 52 and 53 and Psalm 22. Why is this important? In these prophecies and the fulfillment of them, God reveals his sovereignty, his love for you, and his faithfulness. Moses writes about God's abounding in love and faithfulness. In a world that's ever changing, we have our salvation in a God who is our keeper, our protector, our lover, our helper, that is never changing. He's a rock and the rock of our salvation. And we see in these events that God did what was needed to be done to garner our salvation, to pave the way for us to get to him, but actually for him to come to us and pay the admission price of heaven, his son's blood. I hope this gives you some insights about God's eternal word and the prophecies about the crucifixion, an appreciation to see what Jesus has done for us and how this works. And I think prophecies in this way also illustrate the abounding faithfulness of God's word, that it's true and everlasting. I hope this does help you give that, and I want to encourage you to follow us on YouTube. Come frequently to our Facebook page, and I'm going to hold up a QR code. Just see if this is going to work. If you click on that, you can actually, I don't know if you can or not, we'll see if it works. And with your camera, it'll go to this, and you can maybe donate toward Westside Christian Church. We'll see if that works for you. If you want to help us in these times, follow along with our teachings. Next week, I'm going to go over the prophecies of Jesus' resurrection. I love these things. I love teaching. So thank you for being here. I've seen several of you wave. Jody, Emerald, Cody Fears, Mindy, thank you for coming, and I appreciate it. You guys have a great week. Have a wonderful Easter, and whatever you do, give God the glory and honor Him with your life. Thank you. Hello and welcome to a live stream video on a Wednesday night. I have information here about scriptures fulfilled about the crucifixion. And so I've got two different groups going on at the same time.